March the 9th, 1862, an inconclusive battle in the American Civil War transforms the face of naval warfare forever.
Fire!
Flanked by tall wooden ships with billowing sails, two strange alien beasts meet to fight. It is the world's first combat between ships with iron armor, the ironclads. Fighting for the South is a weapon shaped like a huge metal-covered barn roof, the Merrimack. Fighting for the North is an even stranger contraption, the Monitor. Neither can sink the other with shot nor shell. For 9 months, the crew of the Monitor ruled the seas until disaster struck. They left behind poignant photographs and letters that paint a vivid picture of a world poised to change, of a new kind of war. One wrote,
"I think we get more credit for the mere fight than we deserve. Anyone can fight behind impenetrable armor."
This is the story of life and death aboard the first modern warship. Less than a year after their epic battle, both ironclads lay on the seabed. More than 100 years after the Monitor disappeared, her wreckage was suddenly rediscovered. Inside the gun turret, a most momentous discovery was made: the remains of two sailors. The search for their identities has been ongoing ever since. Historian David Mindell has been fascinated by the Monitor for many years. He is visiting Williamsburg, Virginia, just 30 miles inland from where the Monitor and Merrimack fought. It's home to a leading genealogist. Her job is to track down any living descendants of the two skeletons found on the Monitor.
This is kind of familiar footage for me here because I'm under contract with the U.S. Army. I track down the families of soldiers who are still unaccounted for, mostly from Korea, but occasionally World War II and Vietnam. It means a lot when we can identify one of these fellows and bring them home and finally bring some closure to their families.
So how would you go about trying to track down the descendants and who the person is?
Well, what I'll be doing is following the people trail, I guess you could say, and people trail through the paper trail. I'll be looking for any documents that pertain to their lives, anything that can shed information about their families, what their experiences were pre-Monitor, and anything that might help me find out where their families are today.
As a historian of technology, David too will be tracking down the stories of the men on the Monitor.
I'm interested in the people who lived aboard and what it was like to take this new machine for the first time out to sea and then into battle, and how they learned about what its strengths were, what its weaknesses were, and what it felt like for the people inside.
Well, I suppose what we're both doing in different ways is putting some flesh back on the bones, trying to, in a sense, give a second life to these fellows.
The Monitor came out of a crisis facing President Lincoln at the start of the Civil War in 1861. To strangle Southern trade, Lincoln decided to use his vastly superior navy to blockade all major Southern ports. It was called the Anaconda Plan. But the North's largest naval yard at the mouth of the James River in Virginia soon came under threat. As the South closed in, Northern troops fled, torching whatever they could not take, including the enormous frigate, the Merrimack.
The Merrimack was one of the largest steam frigates in the U.S. Navy at the time, and the Union burned it, and it sank right at its dock in the Navy Yard in Newport News. Rather than taking it out of the action, however, that merely caused the South to innovate.
When the South pulled up the wreckage of the Merrimack, the designers decided not to rebuild this wooden frigate. Instead, they covered all 275 feet of her with thick plates of iron and a 40-foot iron ram on her prow. A monster had arisen from the ashes to threaten Lincoln's blockade. Rumors of the South's terrible new weapon sent a shiver of fear through the Union, even touching the heart of the president.
One of the observers commented on Lincoln going to the window and actually looking out the window of the Oval Office, trying to see down the Potomac, whether the Merrimack wasn't steaming up the Potomac here to shell Washington into submission.
The press and politicians began mounting a campaign demanding that the Union build a weapon mighty enough to take on the Merrimack.
And so the Navy convened a board to begin looking at funding a few experiments in ironclad technology.
Looking around anxiously for a solution, Lincoln turned to the eccentric Swedish engineer John Ericsson, who had lived at the sharp edge of technical innovation for over 30 years. Real success, always just one step away. In 1861, amidst howls of derision from competitors, Ericsson produced the design for a ship even more audacious than the Merrimack. The South had merely covered a wooden frigate with metal. His design would be made entirely of iron. The Merrimack had more than 80 guns, but Ericsson's ship would have only 2 because her gun turret would be designed to rotate 360 degrees, so that unlike any ship before, she could remain stationary during a battle and still aim shots at any angle. Ericsson named her the Monitor, and with a 100-day deadline, the frantic construction began on October the 25th, 1861. The bones of the 2 men recovered from the Monitor are stored in military labs in Hawaii. Here, forensic anthropologists have been studying the remains to seek out clues to their identities. The first body has been named Monitor 1.
From this skull alone, because of size and shape differences, I can tell this is a white male. And we can tell that just because of the features. The nasal bones in a Caucasoid individual are very large. The shape of the skull, this is very typical of Caucasoid individual. Rounded, it's not very long, and it's not flat in the back.
This is an important clue because 8% of the crew were African American. Megan's research can focus on the white sailors.
We know that we've got an adult because the growth caps in these long bones have all finished developing. This person has pretty much reached their adult maturity, their size. He's not going to grow in height or in any other dimension.
The length of the leg bone provides an approximate estimate of his height, 5 foot 8 inches. Another vital clue for Megan.
Okay, I'd like now to introduce you to Monitor 2. This is an older individual as far as the age that he died. When we do the biological profile of this individual, we see that he died in his 30s, probably 30 to 40 years old. He's a little bit different height than the other individual, and he had some different features that make him stand out from Monitor 1. He's got arthritic changes that Monitor 1 doesn't have. Some of these guys led pretty hard lives. This is arthritis of the spine, heavy labor, heavy activities, and age-related as well. So not only can we tell something about the biology of these 2 sailors, but we can also tell about their cultural activities. And in particular, it's a little difficult to see, but this individual right here, on the left side of his teeth, we have a pipe stem groove. And that was caused by him gripping probably a clay stem pipe. And it's like sandpaper, it rubs the teeth, and it made a big semicircle. So we know this person was a long-time pipe smoker.
Science can offer more help in the search to name the 2 dead men in what is the most difficult of cold cases.
What it'll take now, though, is DNA. So what we have done is we have taken a bone sample from 1 bone and 1 tooth from each of the 2 monitors. And now what we're going to have to do is somebody's going to have to run down the ancestors. The difficult part is going to be going back how many generations to find somebody. Normally somebody from, if they die from the Vietnam War, World War II, you go back just a couple generations. Some people are living now, and they're very close ancestors and descendants. For the Monitor, they're going to have to go back quite a ways, perhaps, but it can still be done.
Is now handed on to one of the military's leading specialists, Megan Smolenyak.
I've been doing genealogy since the 6th grade. I got a homework assignment from Mrs. Berkowitz, and we had to go home and find out where our surnames came from. And I did not realize that Smoleniak was a weird name until that exercise. We went in the next day and there's a world map, and she put our names up in the countries of our origin, and all the other kids were crowded around the British Isles, and I had the whole of the then Soviet Union to myself. And that's what got me started. It was, genealogy is a slippery slope. You take that first step, you find that first clue, 20 years go by. So that's how I got started.
Records of the 63 men who worked on board the Monitor provide only limited information about those who drowned.
Okay, well, we know from crew rosters and so forth that 16 men lost their lives on the USS Monitor that evening. But ultimately, we wound up with a list of 9 that we really focused in on. For most of these fellows, they died rather young. Some of them were right off the ship from Europe. And so in most cases, all we had to go on was, their basic enlistment details. We knew their name, we knew what country they were born in, roughly what year they were born, and what their height was. And that's about it.
Armed with these facts, Megan will begin trying to whittle down her 16 candidates to a shortlist.
The pipe dream in this situation would be to find DNA for all the candidate sailors, or at least enough until we get the matches on the 2 skeletons to identify who those 2 fellows are, so that they can be returned to their families and properly interred and given the honors that are due to them all these, decades later.
In only 118 days, the Monitor was completed. Her crew had come from every corner of the globe, but their experience had not prepared them for what they first saw on a freezing January the 30th in 1862. Gone were the traditional wooden frigate's tall masts, clouds of sail and gun decks bristling with cannon. Instead, in stunned disbelief, they beheld a metal tube, just 179 feet long, with only a circular gun turret and square pilot house protruding above the water. A full-scale replica in the Mariners Museum, Virginia, dramatically demonstrates this shift.
Yeah, you have these images from sort of older sailing vessels like in Master and Commander and the traditional great wooden frigates and whatnot, but the officers are in the back and the captain has the beautifully set up table and the officers all live and work essentially in the stern of the ship with very well lit rooms and beautifully appointed apartments. And here, the officers' country was actually quite nicely set up, but everybody is mixed up much more together. There's a real social change that came with the new technology of iron.
Yeah, a social change that didn't really set well with the crew, and probably not so well with some of the officers too, the traditional officers, because we all know Navy's very traditional.
While the luxury and space formerly afforded the officers had vanished, the crew were now subject to new and unwelcome surveillance from their superiors.
The wardroom bulkhead that actually separated the crew quarters from the officers' quarters, there were 2 portholes in it, the only 2 portholes in the Monitor, by the way, and they were internal, but it allowed an officer just to stand up and walk out and just to see what was happening on the berth deck.
At one fell stroke, swashbuckling heroes had been transformed into little more than automatons. The Monitor's 63-man crew was not only far smaller, but different in skills from that of earlier ships. Where there'd been dozens of gunners, there were now only 4. Where there'd been carpenters, there were now mechanics. Where there'd been sailmakers, there were now boilermen. And where there'd been riggers, there was now the all-important presence of the engineers.
Herman Melville, when he read about the Monitor, he wrote, "Warriors are now but operatives." An operative was the word for a factory worker, and it was his interpretation of how this heavily mechanical environment was changing naval warfare from this sort of pomp and splendor of the captain strutting around on the deck to this much more mechanical, kind of greasy, dark, iron-covered, factory-like experience, and it was a big change, particularly for the officers, but for the crew as well.
Well, and it also affected the makeup of the crew, because probably for the first time in the history of the United States Navy, you have a crew that's primarily engineering, because it wasn't a vessel, it was a machine.
The Monitor really introduced the world to the idea that you might be now fighting inside machines and with machines.
In addition to those who operated the machine, there were administrators like the accountant, or paymaster as he was known. The Monitor's paymaster was to become the ship's unofficial biographer who charted every step of the Monitor's short life. His name was William Frederick Keeler.
Keeler was a fascinating guy.
He not only witnessed these incredible historical events, but he wrote a series of letters to his wife. Keeler was a very well-read man, very literate, but he was also ever so slightly awkward. In today's parlance, you might call Keeler a little bit of a nerd. First time he sees the ship, he wonders about this strange iron contraption and what it's going to mean for the heroism and the glory that he hopes to bring home from warfare. He writes to his wife, "I saw my iron home for the first time, but I shall not attempt a description of it now. You may rest assured that your better half will be in no more danger from rebel compliments than if he was seated with you at home." Then he says, "There isn't even danger enough to give us any glory."
Slow! But there were dangers, new ones, resulting from the very innovations designed to protect the crew of the Monitor. Confined below the waterline, with no daylight, the crew depended on the machinery for the very air they breathed. If the machine broke down, they would die. Her lethal potential became clear as she hit rough seas.
Within a few days after the Monitor leaves port for the first time, it encounters a storm, and Keeler has this to say about the waves on the deck.
As the day advances, some anxious faces are seen. Now we scoop up a huge volume of water on one side, and as it rolls to the other with the motion of the vessel, it is met by a sea coming from the opposite direction, the accumulative weight seeming sufficient to bury us forever.
Paymaster Keeler preserved hundreds of artifacts and records for posterity, and some of the most personal and evocative have been handed down the generations to his great-great-grandson.
This is actually a little photo album that includes, I believe, his family, and there's also one picture of himself in there.
Well, I've studied and written about William Keeler for more than a decade now, but it's also a great thrill for me to stand here and talk to someone who's actually descended from him. And looking at the photographs and looking at you, maybe I can see a little bit of Keeler's eyes in your eyes. That's the picture that was taken of him the first day when he got his uniform and had his portrait taken in the Brooklyn Navy Yard when he was just joining the Monitor.
So I understand he didn't want a uniform?
Yeah, he thought he was just a regular guy, that maybe he could join the Navy and they wouldn't need to give him a uniform, which of course is sort of touchingly naive, because the one rule of the military is that everyone has a uniform. So we've seen from Keeler's letters quite a number of things about his personality and what kind of a person he was. He was very organized, he was very meticulous, which is why we have these letters. He was a teetotaler, he was opposed to drinking.
Gee, that's very interesting, because my grandmother herself was a teetotaler. My mother was a teetotaler, and I guess most of the family. With the exception of myself, I'll have a glass of wine.
Unfortunately for Megan, the sailors who drowned on the Monitor, unlike the Paymaster, did not hand down orderly records of their lives.
Hi, Cheryl, this is Megan.
Hi, how you doing?
Okay, how about you?
Good, thanks.
I have got another one of my cases that I need your help on.
Okay.
She's on the search for surviving relatives of the skeletons. First, she must narrow down the list from the 16 named men who died.
You can eliminate 3 because they were African American. That much they can be sure of, and they know that the 2 skeletons were not, but that still leaves 13 possible candidates.
It's possible to rule out more candidates using additional data provided by the scientists.
They did what's called isotope testing, which has to do with the water that was ingested during their lifetimes, and it gives an indication of where somebody was in their youth. It's reflected in their teeth. And so the indications are that both of the skeletons who were found in the turret were probably European-born, and possibly lived there till they were 12, 14 at least, maybe even only came to America a year or 2, or even months before they wound up on the USS Monitor. So that led to 6 sailors in particular, and that's where I focused my initial efforts.
This is the list of 6 candidates. William Egan and Thomas Joyce from Ireland, William Allen from England, Bob Williams from Wales, James Fenwick from Scotland, and George Fredrickson from Denmark.
George Fredrickson was so frustrating because there were so many possible records for him and none of them panned out. I had a lot of information on him, so I went looking, for example, for his birth in Denmark. I knew which island he was born on. I searched all 9 parishes, nothing. So then I tried the Danish census records, nothing. So then I went looking for his marriage record, hoping it would give me the names of the parents, nothing. Then I went looking for his wife's burial, find out that the whole family was buried in a cemetery that was completely moved in the 1920s. So then I start following the lines forward, and the daughter died young, apparently childless, and then his son did have 2 children, but don't you know, each of them married late and had no children of their own. So the whole family basically died out back in the 1950s, so very, very frustrating.
Fredrickson wasn't the only dead end. William Egan and William Allen have also been ruled out. Megan must try now to find a living descendant of Thomas Joyce, Bob Williams, or James Fenwick.
What should your next car be?
Today, Newport News at the mouth of the James River is a peaceful marina dotted with pleasure boats and yachts. But in 1862, it was the site of the Southern Navy's most powerful engine of war. Her magnificent new weapon, the Merrimac, waited here for action. On March the 8th, 1862, this iron monster was at last sent to challenge the Northern blockade. One by one, the Merrimac destroyed the Union's outdated wooden vessels as Union cannonballs helplessly bounced off. 2 great frigates were destroyed, and only oncoming darkness prevented her from finishing off the whole fleet. In a little over 4 hours, the US Navy had suffered the most humiliating defeat she had ever endured. The Monitor, racing towards Hampton Roads, represented the Union's last hope of saving the blockade.
Oh, how we longed to be there. But our iron hull crept slowly on, and the monotonous clank of the engine betokened no increase of its speed.
The Monitor arrived just in time to witness, from a few miles away, the full force of her foe's destructive powers. For one night, the Confederate Navy ruled the sea, unaware that the Monitor was heading their way. As dawn arrived on March the 9th, those on the Merrimac saw a strange new contraption emerging from behind one of the few remaining frigates, dwarfed by the massive wooden dinosaur which had concealed her. As the Merrimac approached the Monitor, no one knew what to expect.
Gentlemen, that is the Merrimac! You'd better get below!
Everyone was at his post, fixed like a statue. The most profound silence reigned. We were enclosed in what we supposed to be an impenetrable armor. We knew that a powerful foe was about to meet us. Ours was an untried experiment, and our enemy's first fire might make it a coffin for us all.
On March 9th, the Monitor and the Merrimac went at each other for about 4 hours on a very clear Sunday, late morning and afternoon. Hampton Roads here is a natural naval amphitheater. Thousands of people from both sides witnessed the battle in this crisp, clear weather. But the strange thing was that unlike every other naval battle, there were apparently no people. Instead, just 2 machines going at each other. All the people were buried inside.
Mr. Keeler, tell Mr. Green I'm going to bring us on the starboard side, close alongside, so he knows which side to fire.
As soon as the Monitor went into battle, a major design flaw became apparent. The turret was in the middle of the ship, but the captain and the pilot who were driving the ship were up forward in a pilot house. They couldn't speak to each other. Erickson had designed in a speaking tube that broke early in the battle, and then it was left to people like William Frederick Keeler to run back and forth carrying messages.
Lieutenant Green! The captain says he's bringing us on to starboard! Understood! Fire!
Cannonballs that would formerly have created a lethal barrage of wooden splinters which shredded your opponent's crew now either made clean holes through the side or merely bounced off.
Observers who saw the Monitor pictured it as this willful beast, carefully probing the weaknesses of the Merrimack. The irony was that on board the Monitor, none of the crew really had any idea what was going on. Only the captain could see. Everybody else, including the gun crew, could really not see out at all.
If you can elevate enough, try the wooden gunboat.
Everyone wants to hit the wooden boat!
Understood! Fire!
In theory, the Monitor had the advantage over her opponent, because while the Merrimack had to keep repositioning, the Monitor's rotating gun turret meant she could fire in whatever position she was in.
Tell him we struck her!
In practice, whatever advantage the gun turret's rotation gave was negated by the considerable time it took to reload her two guns.
If the Monitor had hit the Merrimack in any one place 2 times in a row, they probably would have sank the ship. But they never did. They could never manage to concentrate the fire in any practical way.
Why isn't he firing?
Again, design flaws thwarted the Monitor's crew. They couldn't fire directly forwards or backwards for fear of damaging their own ship.
You made a hole! The captain asked why you don't fire!
Tell him I can't do that. If I fire from this position, I risk injuring people in the pilot house, including him.
At 12 noon, after 4 hours of fighting, the Merrimack made a lucky hit, straight onto the viewing slit of the pilot house, while the Monitor's captain looked out.
Sir!
My eyes. I'm blind.
Well, Lieutenant Green, the captain's hurt.
The Monitor now withdrew to change command. After 4.5 hours of fighting, neither ship was in a position to finish off the fight. The Merrimack, afraid of being trapped by the changing tide, decided to retreat also.
Essentially, the battle ended in a draw. Neither ship was sank. Both sides claimed victory. For the Merrimack, they claimed that the Monitor had retreated. For the Monitor, they had obviously prevented a repeat of the carnage of the day before. So the entire event comes down through history to us as one of mixed results. Perfect ingredients for legend.
After the battle, the Monitor's crew posed by the dented turret for photographs which would be published in every northern newspaper. Much to Keeler's surprise, they had become heroes.
I think we get more credit for the mere fight than we deserve. Anyone can fight behind impenetrable armor.
In the following weeks, the iconic status of both ironclads was such that neither side dared risk a rematch in case they lost. And 2 months later, the Southern commanders destroyed the Merrimack because they were afraid the Union might capture her. One of those who drowned on the Monitor was a James R. Fenwick from Scotland. But the documents Megan initially found said that he was too short to match the height of either of the men found in the turret. However, with further research, she's now tracked something down which questions this.
Well, I had almost ruled out Fenwick as a candidate, but what I'm finding now is that there's conflicting evidence about how tall he really was. The Navy had him down as 5'5", but I've got a couple pieces in a paper in here now saying he was 5'8", and just maybe that makes him a candidate now for one of the sailors who lost his life, for one of the 2 skeletons. So this is pretty important because this is bringing Fenwick back in as a candidate.
More digging unearths yet more intriguing information.
One rather remarkable thing we learned was that his wife was supposedly pregnant at the time that he died. So this means, hopefully there could be a descendant out there, and if there's one descendant, we have the chance of folks still living today. So that's a big piece of information that we've gotten from this document.
2 weeks after the Merrimack had been destroyed, the Monitor entered the steamy waters of the James River with orders to shell the Confederate capital, Richmond, into submission. Audaciously invading the enemy's heartland, this would become a harrowing and terrible journey.
This experience was nothing like the brief period of apparent victory and joy in Hampton Roads. During the summer of 1862, the Monitor experienced something that we might recognize from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness or the film Apocalypse Now.
The idea that we were in the heart of the enemy's country did not add a great deal of pleasure to my meditations. Not a man could show himself on the decks without a ball whizzing by him.
Coming up a river during wartime, surrounded by hostile territory on both sides, sharpshooters were firing at the crew, and they knew that they didn't actually need to hit any of them. All they needed to do was to keep Keeler and his compatriots inside the ship. And it was 150 degrees. The men almost literally cooked to death inside the Monitor.
As temperatures increased, the stench of stale perspiration and rotting excrement became increasingly unbearable. Even the air they breathed, which the engines recycled, was fetid and rank. When the coast was clear, some of the Monitor's crew, including Paymaster Keeler, came onto the mainland, and there witnessed the devastation being reaped by the increasingly bloody battles for the possession of Virginia.
The scene that I witnessed there is beyond the power of language to describe. To say a slaughterhouse would convey but a faint idea. Here was a body with the head, one arm, and part of the breast torn off by a bursting shell. Another with the top of his head taken off, the brains still steaming. Partly across him lay one with both legs taken off at the hips, and a little distance was another, completely disemboweled.
After 4 months of misery, the once optimistic crew began to play their own part in the darker side of the war.
They had a ship that was designed for combat at sea, trying to take on a mission for which it was not really appropriately suited. In frustration, they would lash out at the civilian population, even at one point firing on a house like this one, full of civilians, because they had received some fire from the shore. And you could just imagine this enormous naval weapon with these 11-inch guns designed to cut through warships being turned on this very lightly built civilian house.
Ahead in World News Australia, and Pacific pomp and pageantry as Tonga crowns a new king. Detail.
Meghan's search is closing in on the Fenwick family. The census of 1865 will reveal whether James Fenwick's daughter had any children herself.
In the pension file for James Fenwick, it mentioned that his wife was pregnant, and so I was very optimistic that, oh boy, now we've got a descendant to follow. But what I found, she had apparently died in infancy, so no descendants. So that sends me back to the siblings to try to find relatives.
While the search for a blood relation continues, more information about the character of James Fenwick is being unearthed.
You know, the more I get to know about Fenwick, the more I like him, because you can see what kind of human being he was. On the one hand, he was a little bit of a bad boy, had a tattoo. We know from the Monitor's ship log that he got in a couple of brawls and that kind of thing. On the other hand, I have this really sweet letter he wrote to his wife a few days after he married her, bemoaning the fact that he had left early and he wished he had spent more time with her and that kind of thing. So you can see he's a bad boy, but he's got a soft side, and who doesn't like a fellow like that?
On Christmas Day, 1862, the Monitor received what would turn out to be her last orders. She must take a perilous journey to North Carolina through waters notorious for their turbulent weather and sudden storms, known inauspiciously as the Graveyard of the Atlantic.
The wind was blowing violently. The heavy seas rolled over our bows, dashing against the pilot house, and surging aft would strike the solid turret with a force to make it tremble. As well might one stand under Niagara as to attempt to breast the waves which were rolling over our decks. A dim lantern swinging to and fro with the motion of the vessel just served to make the nearest objects visible in the thick darkness. After groping about for a little time, I collected what books and papers I deemed it important to save, but found they made so large and unmanageable a mass that the attempt to save them would be utterly useless and would only endanger my life. I took down my watch and, putting it in my pocket, took out my safe keys with the intention of saving the government greenbacks. The safe was entirely submerged in the thick darkness below the water, and from the peculiar form of the lock, I was unable to insert the key. I desisted from the attempt and started to return. Everything was enveloped in a thick, murky darkness.
As the Monitor began to sink, another ship turned up to rescue her crew. 47 men managed to clamber onto the rescue boat, including Paymaster Keeler. From here, he watched as the Monitor's red lantern bobbed up and down, until with one last terrible movement, the Monitor dragged both the lantern and 16 men to the bottom of the sea.
But the fire of the enemy failed to do. The elements have accomplished. The Monitor is no more.
But for at least one of those who drowned, it turns out that this was not the first disastrous journey he'd made.
Megan here.
Hi, Megan. It's Ellen.
Hey, Ellen. How are you?
Good. I have some interesting information to share with you.
Oh, good.
I was able to find confirming information about the marriage for James Fenwick to Marianne Duff.
Oh, you found the marriage. Great, okay.
So that's great, but there was also some interesting tidbits that I found in the Mariner's house register. James Fenwick happened to stay at the Mariner's house due to a shipwreck.
A shipwreck?
Yes.
You're kidding me.
No. It was really interesting.
Oh, that's wild. So this poor guy got shipwrecked. That's how he wound up coming here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's totally bizarre. And then he wound up dying, just a year and a half later.
Exactly.
Oh, my gosh. Do you know, this is a pipe dream. This is the kind of thing I live for. I just asked one of my researchers to go digging for a marriage record, and what I got was a serious bonus. I asked for a marriage record, and what she found out instead is that one of the sailors was shipwrecked. That's how he actually came to America, James Fenwick. And I've been doing a lot of research, and I haven't seen anything of this anyplace else. So I'm pretty sure we're the first folks to figure this out. And that, I mean, what a story. This guy already had survived a shipwreck before he wound up on the crew of the USS Monitor. And this fellow, that was a very interesting last 18 months of his life.
James Fenwick disappeared along with the wreckage of the Monitor 150 years ago. But only in 2002 was the technology devised to retrieve the gun turret from the bottom of the sea. Today, it is undergoing restoration in the Mariners Museum, Virginia. Jeff Johnson, who helped supervise the recovery mission, was on the site at the exciting moment when the two skeletons were first discovered.
Where did you actually find the bodies when you actually came to excavate it?
Individual number one, we actually found during the initial excavations on site in August. And literally, he was lying right here beside this hatch. In monitor number two, his head was lying just right up under the gun off here.
So this is, yeah. So they weren't far from the hatch. I mean, they were...
Well, this hatch was closed.
Okay.
Remember, now, like I said, that was the hatch out. This was the way from below decks up into the turret, and then you had to go around, right.
So you can almost picture them trying to get out to that hatch,
They
maybe,
would've-
but they were pretty far away. So it's actually kind of surprising that more men didn't die when you think about how difficult it was to get out of the thing.
Well, exactly, and considering the situation they were in, the fact that only 16 men were lost, I think was a miracle.
Yeah.
Standing inside the real turret gives David new insight into what has until now been mere theory.
Well, I mean, I can tell you for a fact what my first day in here was like. I mean, it was just an incredible thrill. What's it like for you to finally get inside the Monitor's gun turret?
To actually stand in here, you get a sense for the size, and you really have a sense for this sort of heavily mechanical environment. Everything is big and sort of oversized and heavy and armored. But then you can picture all those guys in here during that battle, the smoke and the huge noises and the cramped quarters and pitching back and forth, up and down, water coming in, just terrifying and claustrophobic. So you really don't feel end danger from the enemy here, but you do wonder about taking something like this out into the ocean, and that was really the place where they felt that they deserved their heroism more than simply going into battle.
The search is closing in on the family of one of the sailors known to have drowned on the Monitor.
I have finally just managed to place James Fenwick with his birth family over in Scotland, and this has been a headbanger. This has been really tough, believe me. I had a tough time finding him because his family, they were a moving target. They moved every 20 minutes. It looks like his father was a ship joiner. He was a carpenter on ships, and they probably followed the shipbuilding jobs. And this was a trick because it was a census record that would list all the brothers and sisters that would tell me, yes, I found the right family. But I never had a location. But I finally caught a break in the form of a baby sister named Amelia, who apparently died when she was only 18 months old. And by backing into her birthplace, I found a location where the family was in 1851, which was the census year. And she apparently was born on Arbroath. And I can see now the family was living in Arbroath, and I finally have my smoking gun. James R. Fenwick, age 13, already working in the factories, and he's with the right family with the parents Charles and Elizabeth. So finally.
Now Megan's final task is to see if there are any descendants of these people still living. Along with the bodies, many artifacts, including personal items, have been found on or around the wreckage.
So this is actually a rather symbolic artifact for the Monitor because it was potentially the last thing seen before the Monitor sank and the first thing recovered.
Oh, hands down, as Monitor artifacts go, this is by far my personal favorite for just that reason. We know that it was definitely lit the night the Monitor sank because the cracks on the other side are consistent with hot glass plunging into cold water. And, the fact that it was found outside the turret, all the evidence, sort of weighs in that, when Keeler talks about watching that red lantern rise 100 times, fall 100 times till it didn't come up anymore, I think that's the red lantern right there.
It's quite an evocative object because it brings that final scene, literally the final moments, right back to you in Keeler's letters amongst the rest of the crew. And then the fact that it was found slightly off the wreck to the on the seabed really tells you that this was outside the ship when it sank. It wasn't something that was tucked away inside, so it really is the last scene and the first found. It's almost the whole story of the sinking and the recovery right in one artifact.
The paymaster William Frederick Keeler not only survived the Monitor's sinking, but achieved some fame and fortune when his letters were published. Those who drowned, like James Fenwick, soon became just another statistic in the Civil War's catalogue of the dead.
With the 1851 census, I knew finally that I had the right family, and I was able to pick up all the pieces through other census records and vital records, and it turns out that James was actually one of 13 kids. And this case turned out being all about the Amelias. He had not one, but two sisters named Amelia. And it was the first one who died young, but it was another Amelia, the parents apparently recycled the name, used it again, who led me to his living relatives. There was a second sister named Amelia, and she had a daughter named Amelia, and she had a daughter named Amelia.
James Fenwick's great-great-niece is not only still alive, but also called Amelia.
Hello?
Hello, is Amelia Hallidan, please?
It is.
Hi, Amelia. This is a little unusual. My name is Megan Smoleniak, and as you can probably tell, I'm calling you from the United States. And I'm actually calling a bit about your family. I've been trying to track down the family of a sailor by the name of Fenwick.
It was shipwrecked. Oh. Yeah. Oh, it's all so interesting, isn't it?
This was you, and who's your mother?
Yeah. I'd heard about folks, but never about Civil War nor anyone being in the Navy. And I knew there was one, I think it would be a brother or an uncle, maybe my mother's uncle, really, a wee far back. And they always said that he was a ship's carpenter. But whether that was right or not, I don't know.
But although the details of James Fenwick's life have not been handed down, his surname has.
Fenwick was my mother's middle name, and Fenwick was her mother's maiden name. Now I have a lot of neighbours that are interested, and I know more about Civil War now than I ever did.
Just open your mouth.
Now only a DNA match will confirm if James Fenwick is one of the skeletons. Megan is nevertheless satisfied with her research.
When I spoke with Amelia over in Scotland, she had no clue about this part of her family history, and just bringing that back to the family, that to me there is a success. So I'm hoping we actually identify one or both of the fellows, but I'm happy if we just give the family stories back.
Megan has traced James Fenwick's descendants across 150 years. Amelia's DNA sample has nevertheless proved frustratingly inconclusive, matching, but not definitively, the older sailor Monitor 2, and therefore not, as was hoped, the younger man, Monitor 1. The forensic team is now developing more accurate ways of testing DNA, which will eventually confirm whether James Fenwick is indeed one of the sailors found inside the turret. The Monitor sank near Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, a place where the memory of those who drowned still lingers.
I think about the Monitor sailing by here, and the Monitor sinking in a very cold night, not too far from where we are now, and the men who lost their lives on the Monitor in the iron coffin, of which they themselves recognized could be more dangerous to them than the enemy. These were the men who first felt the world of modern warfare, a world that so characterized the 20th century with the airplane and the submarine and atomic weapons. Yet even in the 1860s, when the industrial world was still in its infancy, the crew of the Monitor understood that perhaps there isn't danger enough to give us glory, but going to sea in an untried experiment really could be just as courageous and possibly even as heroic as facing the enemy.